So I want to talk, a lot of you have been very active in open source, and DEI obviously is an important topic. And I think the way we've been doing a lot of recognitions haven't been necessarily helpful. So that's the discussion I want to have. And if you have any feedback on this, or if you have any comments, feel free to stop me. Oops. My cursor's not in the right place. Sorry about that. No, I've lost it. Okay. All right. Cool. A lot of you know me already. I started working on open source community management around 2014, 2015 timeframe when I joined the Linux Foundation. And I was there for about 4 years, involved in several networking related projects. When I joined, there was only one large networking project in 2014, which was Open Daylight. And now they have, I don't even know how many, it's probably close to a dozen projects under LF networking umbrella. So after about 4 years there, I went to GitLab in middle of 2018. And GitLab, as you know, from day one, they started with a contributor and open source ethos, and was happy to, play a part and continue to grow the contributor base for about 2 years while I was there. And almost 2 years ago, it's amazing how time flies. I was talking to my old colleagues at GitLab that are here. Almost 2 years ago, I joined Cube. Have you heard of Cube or CubeDev? Okay, Mary has. But so we're in the business intelligence data analytics space, which is a new space for me. But a lot of the users and contributors in that space are in the beginning, a lot of them were internal developers working in IT. They want to create a common definition of a common metrics based on, for example, a point of sales data, and they want to be able to do a data modeling in consistent fashion so everybody has the same definition and tie it to your whatever framework, front-end framework you're using, like React or others. But now, recently, you're able to, using our SQL API, you can tie it to whatever business intelligence tool that you use, whether it's Metabase or Tableau and others. But yeah, this is not meant to be a sales pitch, but if you want to learn more, feel free to stop me and check out our website. So we'll talk about why recognitions are important. This seems like a rhetorical question, but I'll share three main reasons why I think it's important in open source. Talk about some of the typical recognitions you've seen in a lot of communities, and I'll present some of the negative examples, and those are all mine. These are the mistakes that I made, and I'm not picking on other communities because they're not inclusive. These are the mistakes that I made. So feel free to poke holes on what I've done, and I'll talk about what challenges they present and how we go about addressing those. So why are recognitions important? I think three things. First thing is very obvious. It's important to, in general in life, whether it's in open source or high tech or wherever, you need to thank people to really show them your appreciation for what they do, especially in remote communities. So whether somebody's done, remove a technical debt your community's been carrying for a couple of years. Somebody takes the initiative to fix that huge bug that you've been carrying. That's obviously amazing. And I don't recommend you doing this because I lived through it. Somebody in our old community decided to migrate the wiki tool. And you can just imagine how well that goes. And, I was recipient of a lot of the arrows too, because I was on the foundation staff that sort of supported that person. But if somebody does that, it's not for the faint of heart. You're just getting arrows thrown at you for weeks. But at the end, it worked out well. So they're still using that new wiki tool. But a couple of community members who sort of took the lead on this, I don't think they got a lot of good night's sleep for a few weeks. But if somebody does something amazing like that, it's important to thank them. And the second reason is I mean, every community has like your ethos or values that you aspire to. I mean, it could be written down as community values. I mean, you have written community code of conduct. When somebody exemplifies what you value, like collaboration, you know, diversity and inclusion, and teamwork and other areas. If somebody sort of role models those values, it's important to sort of highlight that, like, you know, make it apparent that we mean what we say, especially for new community members that are joining. So it's sort of, you know, highlighting the role model and then highlighting to the community members that, you know, those values are indeed important. And the third one is sort of, you know, celebration. Like, even if you're taking like 2 minutes during like a technical steering committee call to say, hey, this person Mark, he, you know, fixed these like 5 bugs in the last 2 weeks, and it's important to sort of pause and sort of recognize that, because what happens a lot in remote asynchronous environment is that the meetings are just very task-based. So you go through agenda items, you sort of try to knock discussion points out and get things done, and you just very focus on that. Whereas if you're in a traditional office environment, it's easy to stop by somebody's cube and just give somebody a high five, right? Which is very hard to replicate in remote environments. So I think it's important, even if you have to carve out, like, you know, even if it's an only hour meeting, carve out 2-3 minutes, like every few weeks, to say, I want to highlight these people for a great job they've done and thank them. So I think, you know, keeping the community fun and celebratory, it's pretty important. So what have we seen in the past? And like I said, for people who walked in late, these are some of the mistakes I made as I'm managing different communities. So, I mean, you go to different events and you'll see like charts like this. I mean, one on your left is like number of like a PRs or MRs merged by community members. So, I mean, these are all like made up numbers, but I think you'll get the point. Like, one of the contributors, he or she had 250 PRs merged in a year, and the next person had about 200, so on and so forth. In the second chart on your right, you see a lot of foundations do this. It's not just the LF, but other foundations sort of publish reports like this. And however you define contributions in your community, in your projects, and you have all these member companies that are contributing, and they sort of try to quantify how many people made contributions, whether it's code, whether it's even discussions on mailing lists, or contributing to wiki, et cetera, and you sort of quantify them and sort of list, you know, company A had, you know, 15 people contributing to this project X, et cetera. There are a couple of issues with this, and that you could probably point out others as well. First problem is there's a tendency still today to focus on code contributions, which, you know, back in the day, like, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when open source projects were mostly by and for developers, that may have made sense, because most of the collaboration are happening around code. But that's really not the case anymore. Like, I mentioned I got involved in a lot of networking projects around like 2014 and 15. Even then, I noticed there are a lot of telco operators like AT&Ts, T-Mobiles, and China Mobiles of the world. They don't necessarily have a lot of developer resources like vendors like Ericsson or Huawei, but they have great insights on like use cases. You know, if somebody's working on a feature, like, you want like an actual user, potential users, to have feedback on, this is the use case that you're not addressing, or, you know, you need to tweak your work slightly. So if you just only focus on code, you kind of miss out on those other members of the community that are contributing. And the second is, I mean, you probably know, like, along with Don, I've been part of the chaos community for a long time. So obviously I'm a big fan of metrics and I use them. But if you focus too much on metrics, a lot of times you lose a context of contribution, or you just miss out on things that's very hard to quantify. So those are the two major problems that I've seen on approaches like this. But can you think of other issues with these approaches of like potentially recognizing people? I can just move on, but I'll probably like come back to this in a bit. So, but what about, like, let's talk about other contributions. I think a lot of communities these days in open source are moving away from things like IRC or mailing lists because, I mean, to be honest, like nobody ever loved mailman, although they're still around. A lot of communities are moving to like Slack or Discord or even like Mattermost. And there are a lot of, this happens in every community. There are certain people that are really good about making new people feel welcome, like providing them, like answering their questions, patiently answering their questions, although those questions have been asked like a number of times, and pointing them to onboarding resources or really answering those questions. And those things are really hard to tease out sometimes unless you're reading through all the channels. And as a community manager, this hasn't happened for a while. For a couple of years, I felt like I was getting calls or pinged on LinkedIn like every few months about another startup trying to automate or streamline your, that are developing a tool to sort of streamline your management of Slack conversations. Like they'll have like dashboards or metrics about these are how many people are contributing, these are how many threads that are happening, et cetera, et cetera. So they may tell you the volume of conversation that somebody's contributing to, but they don't really tell you like, was that individual asking a lot of questions, or was that person like really helpful, like answering like people like that are coming on board. So that's, I fully understand it. Those are extremely hard to quantify, right? So you can't really get a sense of that unless you like dig through the conversations in long threads. The other thing, I've had this from some of our community members at Cube. There's a software company that's been using our software for about 1.5 years, and they're looking for ways to contribute back to our community. They didn't have developer resources to help make technical contributions. And they noticed that we have what we call user stories. These are similar to our case studies. And they said, can I help write up a user story based on our use case? And I said, that's awesome. It was, I think by then we only had like 5 or 6 user stories, and this was the first one in the software industry, and this was the first one that was using Snowflake. So this use case is worth its weight in gold, because I just had a call with somebody the other day. I said, is anybody in your community using Snowflake? So there you go, here's a link. Right. So if you think about, Lewis's like contribution from Simon Data, it looks like one contribution, but it's extremely valuable. So you can't just say he just did one thing in 2021 and say that was the end of the contribution. So that becomes, problematic. Like if you try to quantify everything, it just doesn't give you the whole context of what this particular individual has done. The other thing, the third one I want to point out, the bottom 2 diagrams sort of go hand in hand. When somebody comes into a community for the first time, and I've been involved in a lot of communities, I still go through this like imposter syndrome. Like I don't quite know what to do. I don't know everybody, so people feel uncomfortable. And then it's like, sometimes I don't even feel like submitting a PR or opening an issue because I don't want to, I don't want to like lose my face to a certain extent. Like somebody may have opened this issue before, and maybe this was discussed, and I don't want to like rock the boat. This happens a lot, and this is also somewhat cultural too. Like especially I grew up in I spent part of my youth in Korea. Like losing your face is a big deal culturally. Like if you make I think I've been speaking for about 15 minutes. I'm sure I've made at least like 12 grammar mistakes already. I mean, not that I don't care, but I got over that, right? But people from Asian cultures whose first language is in English, like it's like almost like a big source of embarrassment. That's one of the reasons why they don't want to like speak out for the fear of making a mistake. So they don't always want to do stuff in public until they feel comfortable or confident that no one's going to make fun of my accent or grammar. Until they gain that confidence, you might just have like a one-on-one interaction like over like Slack or Zoom, right? And because that's what they're more comfortable with. And like speaking of user story, I found a user in Indonesia. they were collecting a lot of POS data because they were sort of in the retail industry, especially in food services. And I noticed like he was starting a lot of threads and asking interesting questions. And I said, you should do a user story because that's pretty interesting. It's in a new geography, like the point of sales industry. And he said, sure. But he never wanted to get on the phone because he was very like uncomfortable like speaking English, like which you wouldn't know conversing with that person on Slack. Like his English was like more than adequate, and we just collaborated over Google Docs and Slack. In a week, we had a blog post like ready to go. But that was his comfort level, right? I mean, maybe like he was constantly using like a Google Translate all the time while he was typing those messages on Google Docs or Slack, but you want to give that person an opportunity, like if they're comfortable, like, you know, contributing like this in this space, then give that person the space, right? Don't force that person to, you know, do everything in the open when they're not ready yet. So, I mean, and some of that is cultural, right? And then that was like the first time I ever collaborated with somebody like without getting on the phone ever, but it worked out pretty well. And hopefully he thought it was worth his time too. And this was my major learning, and this is the sort of an inspiration for why I wanted to sort of give this talk. I gave a similar talk at FOSDEM earlier this year. Not everyone is comfortable with public recognition. They just rather have somebody, you know, I'm making a office analogy. They just want somebody to come to their queue, give them a high five, and be done with it. They don't want to stand on stage. They don't want to be publicly recognized, and that's completely fine, right? And the other reason why I thought about this a lot last year was that we have, like other communities, like we did at GitLab, we have a heroes program to sort of recognize top contributors. I mean, our ranks of heroes isn't that large. We currently have only 4 people, but you know, even when I started, I wanted to sort of, you know, find out who the regular contributors were and what kind of contributions they made. And during the process of last year, I reached out to a few people, like, I think you would make a great hero. I'd like you to extend an invite and become one of our heroes. And their responses were almost identical. They says, I don't think I've done enough. Like, I don't think I really qualify to be a hero. And it turned out, I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, they're both female. And so that sort of had me worried, because this reminded me of like when you have a job description, you have 10 bullet points, and if typically, like, you know, typical male engineers in Silicon Valley, if they've done like 7 of them, I've done Python, I know MySQL, then they'll just apply. Whereas female, well, I haven't done like 3 of those things, so I don't think I'm qualified. That's sort of the mindset from underrepresented community. So I was kind of worried about that. Is there a problem with my recruiting pitch, or is this the way the program's sort of been presented to them? So I reached out to 2 of my former managers, who are both female and pretty active in DEI initiatives, and said, you know, here's our web page, and here's sort of how I've been identifying, approaching people. Like, can you see any issues with what we've been doing? And then both of them actually said, what's your goal for this program? Like, no matter what it's called. And so what I told them was, it's not just recognition, although, I mean, as community managers, I think we all like recognizing people. That's part of it, but what I told both of them was that I wanted to have sort of a trusted advisor group that I can reach out to in the future. Like, whether we're making big product changes, like we want to change the user interface, I want to reach out to these core group of people, or I want to come up with a new policy for our community, and I want to have a core group of people that I can ping for advice and sort of guidance. And both of them says, then why don't you present it like that? Like, they obviously like contributing and helping people. Maybe that's what they're motivated, maybe that's their main motivation, rather than, because they thought I was just focusing way too much on like recognizing them. It's like sort of anointing them as heroes. And they weren't like overly concerned, but the term heroes they didn't think was too like friendly to all segments of the population. I mean, I think when I hear the word heroes, I think of like a Marvel heroes, I guess. And is that like necessarily inclusive? That's another thing that we can think about. So we even thought about like changing the names, but we obviously didn't go that far. But we just made a tweak to how I approach people. I don't really mention recognition first, and then we obviously change our wording and positioning on our web pages to hopefully that's a little bit more friendly. So that's one of the things that I went through with a few individuals last year. And then while doing that, I sort of had to do more like unpacking, I guess, or reflection. It's like, am I doing this to really thank them and even recognize people, or am I trying to show off how cool our community is, right? And then if I was being completely honest, there was some element to that. Like I want to show off what kind of cool people we have, and I mean that's kind of fun thing to do, but that shouldn't be my main motivation. It's why am I really recognizing people? That should be my main concern. Let's see. Cool. So how do we go about making our recognitions more inclusive? I mean, this is pretty obvious. I said a few slides ago, we need to look beyond code. And even if you look at the code, like let's say you look at GitLab or GitHub repo, and somebody added this amazing feature because they worked for a long time, and we have this like a new bells and whistle to our product that we didn't have before. I almost guarantee you, like outside of activities on the repo, there are other people that help like adding that feature or removing the technical debt. Because that's why I try to get on the phone or Zoom call with the individual. Like I like to learn more about like your reasons for contributing and what was sort of involved. And there'll be other people that help with like things like testing that would never show up on as in the commit records. So if I just if I just recognize that one person who showed up on GitHub, then I'm excluding like potentially several people that have sort of helped out with that work. So I sort of make it a point, like before I like reach out to people, I can't guarantee that it happens all the time, to really understand like what kind of work was involved and who else sort of helped out, so that I'm more inclusive. I talked about metrics. One of the things I like to do, I mean, this sort of related to what I said about reaching out to people before I recognize them publicly for their contributions is, I mean, one of the things like every community managers do is you have like a virtual coffee chat with them. Like it's become a norm since the pandemic. And, try to get better understanding or context in terms of why they contributed and what was sort of involved. And it's important to, we have a Notion page of my conversations with community members. I mean, I thought about, like, we also use Orbit for our dashboarding. I mean, I try not to like instrument things too much. Like I might record those conversations to give proper context to their work. But I think what I see very often in a lot of communities is that they spend way too much time like instrumenting stuff or trying to make it turn something into a metrics when it doesn't like necessarily make sense. So I mean, Don, you may have heard me mention this book. There's a book called Tyranny of Metrics. Like I said, I'm a big fan of metrics. I use them all the time, but there's a point where there's like a point of diminishing return. And that's what this Professor Mueller talks about in his book. He's a history professor, and then he found a problem in academia. Like there are way too much time, people are spending way too much time to get funding, like instrumenting stuff, like trying to quantify everything. And rather than spending resources on like maybe teaching students at universities, but they're just hiring staff to like instrument things. So just a word of caution. And the other reason why I like to have these conversations is that almost every time I talk to them, they want to find other ways that they can contribute to the community. So, you're thanking them for the work they've done, but they're saying, besides like, helping you triage bugs, like, is there something else that I can do? Or is there other like insight I can provide? And So I definitely like those conversations, and those things like you're not going to get when you try to like instrument things like beyond what's even necessary. Cool. So what other things should we be thinking about for recognitions? I mean, one is, I've done this like when I was at the LF, we had like a 6-month release cycle. So we do like a big recognitions like every time we do a release. But that's nice. Like every 6 months we have this big celebration, either in person or virtually, to celebrate people's recognition. But what I sometimes neglected to do was like recognize somebody on the spot. When somebody did something great, like, streamline the wiki page, for example, just thank them on the spot, even if it's just a DM, right? Rather than waiting until like when the release is done, and 6 months later, the person may have moved on to something different, or you just lose the context, right? So go ahead, sir.
Forgive me,
Yeah.
Wait,
No.
how large is the community you're talking about?
So good question. So I've been involved in several projects at the LF. And so OPNFE was one of the projects they rebranded since then. I think at their peak, they probably had about 200 to 300 active contributors. And obviously GitLab was my next journey in open source that had typically about 1,000 people that are making contributions to our repo. And right now at Cube, I would probably say 50 to 100. So, but anyhow. Yeah, so, and then I think, like, I appreciate that question, because if your community gets large, like, then it becomes worse. Like, if you wait even a month to, like, thank somebody, you've sort of lost the opportunity to a certain extent. I guess it's better late than never, but, if you see something, just thank them on the spot, like, whether it's a DM or something else. And two, so, for community managers, swag or merchandise, it sometimes can become like it just takes a lot of your time sometimes, and you have to ask yourself, just like instrumentation, am I overdoing this? Because if you think about it, it's really not about the merchandise. Like, nobody's motivated to do something because they got a $25 t-shirt or even a $50 backpack, right? I mean, if that's their motivation, then I think you have a different problem. So don't stress too much about like a merchandise, and because it's difficult to pick the right ones that meets like everyone's needs. So you need to be like very thoughtful about that, and that's not exclusive. I made this mistake at GitLab. I handed out like different colored baseball caps, and then certain parts of Europe. I think like certain parts of Europe, you see more people like wearing baseball caps. I think UK is like one of them. Not as many as you do in the US. But if you go to like Greece, like it's almost like unheard of, is what they told me. So like, that was a learning for me. They weren't offended or anything, but it wasn't as valuable as people in the US or like even Japan or Korea, where it's more of a baseball playing country, right? So. And this wasn't necessarily a recognition. We do a technical workshop at Cube, and as a thank you for somebody filling out a post-event survey, we used to send out like trinkets, like power cables. I'm forgetting like multi-tools, et cetera. And somebody from Berlin sent me an email saying, "Please don't send me anything because I'm trying to reduce my carbon footprint." And basically it was a nudge, like, why are you doing this? Like, you're like, I appreciate this, but this is like a $15, 20 item, and you're spending another 15, 20 item on shipping, and I'm not helping the environment, right? So I switched tack. Like the last few months, we've been making donations on their behalf to organizations like The Last Mile or Girls Who Code, rather than spending the money on sending out trinkets. So I appreciated that nudge. From the community member in Germany to remind us it's not just about swag. The third one, letting community members participate in the recognition process. So my favorite example, again, is with OPNFE. Like, we used to have annual summits, and the highlight of that summit at the the last day, the last item was sort of everybody gets together in a ballroom, and we do recognitions. And we also award like top contributors. What was meaningful was that all the nominations and votings were done by community members. Like I didn't have a vote because I was a foundation staff member. All I did was to administer the vote on Condorcet, help with the nomination process, hand out the award. That was it. But I think for people, I think we like selected like we had like a fun giveaways too for people, like for example, people who helped with the wiki migration that year. I gave them like a snow shovel, like because they had to shovel stuff out of the way. But the top contributors, when you talk to them, they said it was more meaningful because it came from the community. It wasn't the technical steering committee chair or board member like anointing somebody. It came from community members. So it just really made it a lot of fun. And it was like very grassroots. And something I did at GitLab, I had like a nomination form. It's just a simple Google form because the community, we had 1,000 people contributing like each year just on the repo. It's hard to know what's all going on. So I said, if you see somebody's done a great work, just please send in a Google form so I can reach out to them. To be honest, it wasn't as like active as I liked it to be. I probably should have done a better job of sort of advertising it, but I kind of like that grassroots aspect too. Like we'll reach out to them and sort of highlight them, but that's something else that you can probably consider doing. Final talking point here, avoid ranking contributions or organizations. And that goes back to this slide here. Although your intention wasn't to rank people, it's hard not to look at it that way without the context, right? So especially the chart on the right, the larger the organization, you have a clear advantage, right? If you have 10,000 people versus like a 50-person startup, you're just not going to have the same amount of resources or bandwidth to contribute to an open source project. So how does that make you feel if you're coming from a 50 or 70-person startup company, right? And then same thing with like individual contributors. This comes up like, especially at my current role or even at GitLab, like we'll talk about contributors like internally, and then one of the questions that would inevitably come up is that, can we ask these people to do more? I said, okay, so how I would answer that question is, I think we should be asking, how can we make it easier for them to contribute more, rather than, burn more of your spare time? Because unlike foundation-based projects, they're not like paid from their companies to contribute to your projects, right? So like, I don't want to ask people to spend less time with their family or their hobbies or even watching a soccer game, which is what they enjoy doing. Like, that's like, I don't feel comfortable like asking like active contributors to do more, because that's problematic. Like, I'm not being sensitive to their needs. And one of the things we did, this wasn't the work I did, our engineers did this at GitLab. They made like what GitLab development kit more usable for different audiences, better user interface, easier to install on your laptop, etc. So lowering the barrier to entry to making it easy, that makes sense, but we should probably not be asking people, can you just do more? Like, can you submit like 10 more PRs like this year? That just doesn't feel right. So cool. Some final thoughts. So, obviously a big realization for me last year was, remember the reasons for recognizing your community members. It's not to show off. It's not just to show off to the rest of the world what kind of cool people have in your community, although that's nice, but, think of the real reasons why you're recognizing people. And we tend to, at least I did in my life, focus on how much somebody's contributing rather than what and how and where, right? And especially outside of your code base, like, how are people, like, how they're working together, how they're collaborating. So I think where and how is more important than how much in most cases. And yeah, this is sort of repeating what I'm saying, like, as you're recognizing people, try to understand, it's impossible to talk to everyone. I understand that. Like, I can't do that either, but try to get more context into, what motivated them to contribute and, what their experience was like. Yeah, because I don't think I mentioned this. They'll, during those conversations, you'll get a feedback on, your onboarding document wasn't very clear on how like XYZ works. So those feedbacks like very valuable, and then I think having those interactions like pretty important. And the final thing, I've seen, like, I forget which community it was, and I'm trying not to pick on any community either. They've had like a top contributor program. I don't know what the name was. I don't know if it was Hero or somebody else. They had like 3 tiers. Yeah, if you do this, you're on bronze. Like, I'm just making that up. And if you do this much, then you're a silver. And if you do more, then you're gold. Or it's almost like a open source foundation membership, right? And when I looked at that, and this goes back to quantity issue, right? Like, are you really, encouraging people to spend more time on like contributing to your project versus spending time with your family or their hobbies? So I didn't find that too like inspiring when I saw that. And then that also felt like, to me, felt very transactional. Like, because you should be all about relationship building with your community members versus saying, oh, you did this much, so I'm going to give you this. You did this much, and I'm going to give you a different trinket. That felt like a somewhat transactional. So I would think carefully before we're doing this. The only time when you're having those different tiers make sense, that based on my experience, is when you're having a fun, almost like a context type activity in a limited window. So let's say some community has like a bug triaging event over like a 24-hour period, right? And if somebody, triage like this much, you can have like a different tiers, almost like a fun contest. And you're not required to participate, but I think that's fine. Like, I think that could work, but you don't want to be like overtaxing people either. So there's a fun balance. So if you sort of time bound things and make it a sort of a fun activity versus, assigning value to somebody's contribution, I think that could work. But yeah, when I was like looking through different like recognition programs at different companies, when I saw that at that company's website, that kind of made me think a bit about trying not to be transactional with your community members. As I said, I gave this similar talk at FOSDEM, and I made a blog post on opensource.com. That's summarized pretty much what I said. If you have any comments, like, feel free to leave them there. I forgot to ask like questions of you, and feel free to like ask me questions as well. Have you seen like good like recognitions that you thought that was cool, or maybe you're a recipient of it and you still remember it after like 10 years? I don't know if you have good examples, but go ahead, Ben.
So I'm biased.
There we go.
So I'm biased, but I'm really fond of Fedora's Badges system because it doesn't really cost us any money. We don't have to send stuff to people. And it's a way that we can provide pretty instant recognition across a variety of ways. So some of them are tied to pushing commits to repos, but there's also things like editing wiki pages, changing your password, adding your time zone into the account system, things like that. So it's really diverse across a broad array. And then you people can request new badges. So talk about like making it open to the community to participate. So you say, oh, I'm going to run this event. Can we have a badge for that? Or here's a thing that I think we should recognize. Let's make a badge. And so it's just a way to kind of gamify things, and it encourages people when they look at what badges are available. I know I've done it. I'm like, oh, I could earn this badge by running the kernel regression test suite. I'm going to go do that. And I never
Right.
would have done it had I not seen that there was a badge for it.
Okay. So is this like a virtual badge thing that shows up on people's profiles?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, some level of gamification, I think it can make it fun, and I think those are completely appropriate, I think. Any other comments or questions? I mean, that kind of reminds me of like one of the TSC chairs that I work with. I think he's still at Nokia. He gave an example. We were talking about like a recognition in general. I think we're like nearing the end of the release cycle or something. And he said there was a project, open source project he worked on like 15 years ago when he was at Nokia. I think he's still there. And then they gave out some trinket. And he said he still has it on his desk at his office because it just brings a lot of good memories about people that he worked with. It's just a lot of emotional meaning. It doesn't I don't know how much it costs, but it's just like a nice little trinket that reminds him of the community that he enjoyed working with. And he said that just means a lot because it also came from community. And I think we all have like examples of those, like in our desk, like even if it's in the desk drawer, that just you feel an instant connection with that community member, although you left like 15 years ago, right? So those are. So obviously it's not about creative swag or tchotchkes. It's about emotional connection with the rest of the community and giving you a sense of belonging. So go ahead.
So I have a number of questions.
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate
No, it's okay.
the conversation. My back is to everybody, so I can't tell if anyone else wants.
Can you feel free to use the mic?
So I run a nonprofit that does open source hardware things, but it's very different than what you have. Like I don't have a community of 100, so I talk to every single person on my team, and so it's a very, very different situation. My question for you is, let's say someone shows up to a software project, makes a pull request, right? Like, how many pull requests do they make before they typically talk to a human being in the community? And is the sense of community all electronic, like they code review someone else's pull request? Or is it formed by like little events and virtual meetings and things that you have?
Right. So thanks for the question. So, I mean, and then feel free to just stop me if I'm not heading in the right direction, your spirit of your question. Somebody like responding to your pull requests, I mean, although it's not like over the phone or Zoom or anything, like, I mean, I set a goal of like within 5 business days, somebody should at least acknowledge it, even if it's like adding labels or just, especially if it's a first contribution, I like to put at least like an emoji, like a thumbs up. There should be a good hygiene. Like it's not just me, but somebody from the engineering team needs to constantly look at that, gets it labeled, and then say acknowledge that we see it. No guarantee on when it's going to be merged or closed or any of that, but at least like a first acknowledgement should happen pretty instantaneously. I think for a lot of communities, these happen like virtually. But if you have the budget for this, like big projects like Kubernetes or CNC, or all the CNCF projects, there's a reason why people get together. They're still meeting twice a year, right? The CNCF or yeah. So I mean, it builds like enormous like value for your community members to get together, and you could have like a hackathon that'll go along with the summit, so to speak, so people actually collaborate in person and really get to like thank people in person. That's important. But even if that's not possible, like what I try to do is if I see an interesting contribution and no guarantee that I'm going to catch all of them, I like to just reach out and say, hey, I'd like to jump on a call with you, like no matter what time zone you're in. So within a reasonable time frame, and I'm amazed that they feel like almost honored that they're approached by somebody from the company. And then it's just, even before I send them something, they just feel appreciated and feel connection because they like the technology and they just feel very welcome, and then they feel comfortable like not only using the software but being actively involved. So hopefully that answered most of your question, but please let me know if I haven't.
Well,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
I've never.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
I've submitted pull requests and bug fixes to small projects, and I used to maintain an open source project, but I've never been a part of a large team of hundreds that did this. So I don't understand how the social interaction on such a large team works. So I think you did answer my question, that someone who's a first-time committer has at least some chance of a human interaction, even if it's a 2% chance. But as they do more, they're going to have electronic email interaction with members of the team, and that forges at least some sense of community.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I think to a certain extent, automation in either GitHub or GitLab really helps. I mean, we're doing this in my current role at Cube, and we did this at GitLab too. If the contribution comes in from the community, it gets immediately labeled community contribution, or you can pick whatever label you like, and then I subscribe to those labels, right? So I see them, and what I would do today, and even at GitLab, I would look at which part of the product it is. I would assign it to the lead engineer. Say, hey, Mark, can you look at this? And sort of, so they know which team is sort of responsible for reviewing their contribution. So even if it's not completely like personal, like automation I think helps. I don't think people will view it as being impersonal, so they know, at least they know like somebody saw it and somebody's going to take a look at it. So go ahead, Don. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
Just to add to that a little bit, I think, when you're thinking about these large open source projects, you actually need to think about them as smaller sub-projects. So if you look at Kubernetes, it's dozens of smaller sub-projects, and people tend to focus in on very specific areas. The other thing that's different about these very large projects is they often have loads of project meetings that are over Zoom that anyone can drop into. So a lot of people can just drop into one of the weekly meetings for a particular area or for the whole project, and you can get some personal interaction that way as well. So don't think of the large projects as being less personal than the smaller ones, because I think in some ways they're actually probably more personal because they've learned to do this at scale.
Yeah. And Don, I think you're part of like, I think at least you were like part of the onboarding team in the Kubernetes community, right? So.
I was. I'm less
Okay.
involved in that now,
Yeah.
but I'm involved in the CNCF contributor strategy technical advisory
Cool.
group now, which is
Yeah.
kind of the same thing. It's how do you
I know you're not going to be offended. Hey, Don, like, who do I reach out about this PR I submitted? And then Don could direct people to appropriate places. And we also had a page at GitLab, and so we would have list product managers and engineering managers for different areas of our product. I mean, not everybody's able to find them because we have so many like handbook and web pages, but having those pages like helpful, like, hey, if you have any questions about who you need to ping on your merge request or PR, like here's a list of people. And I've seen other communities do that too. They'll list like what we call PTL, like a project team lead. So at least you know who to sort of escalate it to if you don't think you're getting the response that you need. So. Yeah, I mean, so even if the project's big with thousands of contributors, I've seen like a lot of communities do them really well. So, other questions? Oh, go ahead. So I'll bring the mic.
I got it.
All right, thank you.
So I wanted to get thoughts on ways to, and I missed some of the first part about just any of the chat groups or other communication methods that might be part of these communities. But thoughts on ways of encouraging maybe participants within the community to do some type of like peer recognition and engagement rather than it just being like kind of the leaders and owners of the community that have the responsibility for being engaged in recognizing, but to have at least more of that scaling of, as peers, how do we recognize and support and encourage each other as well to
Right.
keep building on that versus it just being like a lot more of that hierarchical, because
Right.
it's great to get that from leadership, but also there's a lot
Right.
more of the contributors versus the leaders and
Right.
owners of the community.
No, I completely agree. I all about grassroots recognition. That's why like a nomination forms help. And like we don't have that at Cube. I mean, maybe we're at a point where we need to institute something along those lines. But sometimes people just ping me and say, Ray, have you like seen this person like answering all these questions on Slack? And sometimes because it's in a channel that I normally don't subscribe to, like I completely missed it, right? And then I don't think I was being lazy, but I really appreciate when those people sort of reach out to me. And yeah, I mean, like whether it's like a formalized like a Google form or just, you know, make it known to your community members. If you need to tell like somebody in the community management team or elsewhere about somebody's great work, I think that makes complete sense. And I think it's more genuine as well. So. Yeah, I mean, one of the heroes that we added to our ranks recently was he still to this day, like I mean, he told me he's like addicted to Slack, which, okay, like I won't go there, but he said he thinks that he needs to like read all of them, like almost like instantaneously. That's why he's so good about, like he said, it's not just our Slack, like his company Slack too. He's like, he's on top of things. Like, I don't know how, but, and you know, he's been so helpful, like onboarding like new community members and answering questions. I thought he was very deserving, and he's one of the active members today. So. Any other questions? Or really appreciate you coming on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. You could be down in Manhattan Beach, but I mean, FOSDEM is a different animal because first weekend of February in Brussels, the weather is like iffy, so you can understand people being in a room. Like in Southern California, not so much. So, thank you, and I'll be around if you have other questions. I mean, feel free to ping me on Slack or on the blog post on opensource.com, and have a safe trip home if you're traveling. So, thank you.